There is a lot of discussion amongst Australia's broader right as to how it deals with the issue of the growth of One Nation support since the 2025 election. And a lot of people are saying that, at least within both the Nationals and the Liberal Party, that needs to be engaged somehow, that they need to adopt their policies and make some sort of like agreement with them. But here's the thing, we actually have an example in living memory in Australia of an election where One Nation spiked to unseen heights and the damage that associating with them did to both the National Party and the Liberal Party. And I think it's worth taking a look at how that election panned out so we can appreciate what the coalition needs to do going forward if it wants to survive. The election that I'm talking about is the infamous 1998 Queensland state election, which people who follow Australian politics to a certain level and love looking at elections know that the 1998 Queensland state election was one of the most bizarre and unbelievable elections that has happened in the history of this country. So a little bit of background to this election. So in 1998, leading up to the election, the National Liberal Coalition was in power. That is not me misspeaking. You have to remember, up until this point in Queensland, the National Party was the senior party in the coalition. So it was actually the National Liberal Coalition with the Nats, thanks to a lot of gerrymandering, but many other reasons, particularly how rural the state was by far the bigger political party, with the Liberals being their city-based junior coalition partner. So anyway, the National Liberal Coalition, as weird as that sounds to say, was in power, but they had only come to power by taking advantage of a hung parliament. At the previous election, it was basically deadlocked, with one crossbencher deciding who would actually form government between the coalition and Labor. He originally supported Labor, but then throughout the term, he was actually convinced to support the coalition instead. So the National Liberal Coalition came to power purely through a hung parliament. And the National Party wasn't too happy with governing in minority, so they said, you know what, 1998, early election, we are going to go to the polls and get a majority of our own, which did not end up happening. Now, the traditional dynamic of Labor versus the coalition was essentially thrown on its head as soon as the campaign kicked off, because One Nation announced that it would be fielding candidates for this state election, and they were polling very well. One thing you have to understand about the late 1990s in Australia is that there was a lot of conservative pushback against John Howard's government. Gun reform being one thing that got conservative voters really frustrated, particularly in the country and rural areas, a lot of like what you have in Queensland. Pushback against the introduction of the GST, pushback against reforms to native title. Basically a lot of dog whistling, and nobody was doing it better than Pauline Hanson, talking about her fear of being swamped by Asians. So she had a lot of appeal in Queensland, and that was transferring into some pretty scary numbers for the coalition. In the lead up to the election, One Nation was polling just under 20%, which was of course concerning because that support was coming from traditional die-hard national voters, which is not a good thing if the National Party is like the core of the coalition in the state. To try and deal with that pressure, there was actually a preference deal struck where the coalition would preference One Nation ahead of Labor, and that we will come back to later, but was kind of evidence of how desperate the coalition was to not be completely destroyed by One Nation. So we come up to election day, we have a very divided conservative side of the spectrum between three different parties. You have city conservatives represented by the Liberals, traditional rural conservatives represented by the National Party, and then you have One Nation that's trying to replace what is the mainstream form of conservatism, all of them going against Labor. And election day rolls around, and it is insane. On polling day, Pauline Hanson's One Nation got just under 23% of the statewide primary vote, beating both the National Party and the Liberal Party. This is the only time since the formation of the current two and a bit party system post-World War II where neither a coalition branch or Labor have come second in the popular vote at an election. This election was so profoundly weird. And like, to help you guys understand, there literally isn't a two-party preferred vote for this election. The Queensland Electoral Commission didn't even try because it would have been impossible to work out here. First of all, you have One Nation coming second, the biggest branch of conservatism in the state, and optional preferential voting was a thing in Queensland, so a lot of people just went into the ballot box, ticked the party that they liked, and then didn't actually fill out a proper preference flow. So because of that, it's really difficult, if not completely impossible, to try and get together and make a two-party preferred vote out of this absolute mess of a result. Anyway, that bizarre vote share essentially translated into a parliament that looks like this, which is very weird to look at. We have the Labor Party essentially staying exactly where it was, while conservatism shattered into pieces. Basically, what was happening when you look at actual seats is that we had a bunch of very weird contests that nobody was really prepared for. Labor not only had to fight Liberals in the city, but in its more rural areas, it suddenly had to fight One Nation as well, which was also an issue facing the Nationals, because they were used to incredibly safe, like 70% two-party preferred vote seats out in the country, but because One Nation was targeting their specific voters, out in rural areas, we saw swings of up to 30% against the National Party, meaning the Nats had to compete in areas that they had no history of doing so, defending their seats literally everywhere because nowhere was safe. So the coalition had that massive problem in the country, trying to defend its traditional base, but it also faced massive issues in the city, particularly in Brisbane. You remember how I mentioned that they were doing preference deals, the coalition with One Nation? Well, that actually scared away a lot of centre-right, traditionally liberal voters. So in Brisbane, it was an absolute Labor bloodbath. And for every seat that Labor lost in more like outer city areas to One Nation, they made up for it by taking seats away from the Liberal Party in cities. So anyway, end result is this. We have the Labor Party 1 seat short of a majority, the coalition in a crippled position, 11 members of One Nation, overtaking the Liberals, by the way. I think this is the only time the Libs have ever come fourth in terms of seat share in an election. And then we have 2 independents holding the balance of power. So look, government formation was kind of a foregone conclusion. Of course, the Labor Party was going to get the support of just one of those independents and form government. But there is, of course, or rather there was a potential that a One Nation Nationals Liberal coalition could have come together and gotten the support of those 2 independents. Because as crazy as that sounds, the conservative side of politics in this election did get around 54% of the vote total, if you count all Liberal, National and One Nation votes together. But the likelihood that they would have been able to actually pull that off, I'm very skeptical. And it is a kind of irrelevant because actually during that term, a One Nation member of parliament had to resign after allegations of domestic violence, and that by-election was then won by Labor, bringing them to majority government. So what happened after this? What happened to this grand mess of a opposition in Queensland's parliament made up of 3 vastly different conservative parties? Well, it didn't work too well. One Nation kind of collapsed in on itself over internal divisions about party structure and leadership style. The coalition didn't really leave much of an impression at all. And when the 2001 election rolled around, by focusing on the state of conservatism, the Labor government was able to argue, look, if Labor isn't the government, it's going to be some insane coalition of One Nation, the Nationals, and the Liberal Party. So when the 2001 election rolled around, the results look like this. Ouch. The Labor Party got almost a majority of the primary vote by campaigning on a message of Conservatives being completely disunified and in a state of complete chaos. And that worked incredibly well, giving Labor their biggest majority in Queensland's parliament ever, and they were in power for another 11 years after this. So what is the takeaway from this? Well, I think for the Liberal Party, the message is if you try to engage with, do preference deals, or try to mitigate the growth of One Nation by having some sort of devil's handshake with it, well, you're going to get torn to shreds in the cities even more than your party currently is. So essentially, make that deal, and it means extinction in Australia's major cities. So the lesson here for the coalition, which they will definitely not listen to, is that if, like the Queensland Coalition in 1998, They try and make like a devil's deal. You know what? Preferences back and forth. That's how we'll engage with One Nation. We'll give them a clear endorsement as preferential to Labor itself. Well, that's just going to scare away every moderate voter you have and not achieve your goal at all. Because that hung over the coalition's head for the next 3 years. And then in 2001, their association with One Nation led Labor to its biggest landslide win ever in Queensland. Now, look, the modern Liberal Party is not smart enough to take that advice. But you know who did? A hero of the Liberal Party, John Howard. When he saw what was happening in Queensland, and there was actually a federal election coming up in the same year, he made the decision in a deal with Labor that the two major parties would preference each other before they would One Nation. A guarantee that the Liberal National Coalition would put One Nation last. And Howard won re-election that year. Not because he did some deal with the devil through Pauline Hanson or her extreme form of conservatism, but because he refused to touch it. Look, I could do a whole series on the damage that John Howard did to this country, to the economy, to the union movement, but one thing that I have to say to his credit, aside from guns and GST reform, is that when he was faced with the rise of the far right in Australia in the 1990s, his approach was not preference deals and appeasement. It was to agree with Labor that we're going to make sure that this group doesn't grow. If you give the hard right an inch, they will take a fucking mile. John Howard was aware of that. And I just pray and hope that whoever is leading the Liberal Party in 2028 has the same realization that he did, that the rise of the far right needs to be fought, not appeased. But I'm not going to get my hopes up.